In this session, we're discussing the beginnings of jazz. As you can already imagine, based on the last couple sessions, the exact genealogy of jazz is a controversial and not at all straightforward affair. People have a very vested interest in its history. Some people want to tie it very much into folk traditions, especially the legend around Congo Square. Some people feel very strongly that the more closely you tie it to that, the more you make it a true African-American innovation. I'll say up front that it's an African-American innovation no matter how you go about parsing its history, so that may not be an overriding concern for supporting the Congo Square narrative, which largely has been historically shown to have been a separate tradition. Other people feel very strongly that what we're dealing with here is a invented tradition, that it is a moment where people have consciously put together a new style of music in contradistinction to things that have gone before, and that would seem to downplay the influence of ragtime on jazz. And for some people, that's, again, they have a very strong concern with the distinction between ragtime and jazz. As we'll see, performers like Joe Oliver and Louis Armstrong felt very strongly in the opposite direction, that jazz really was an extension of ragtime. There are other sort of extensions of orchestrated ragtime that we've already talked about with Wilbur Sweatman and with James Reese Europe, that it seems to me had a greater impact on the beginnings of jazz than is sometimes allowed. But to a certain extent, this is a sort of subjective matter, I suppose. When exactly does something move from these earlier precedents into being jazz? And so I think the best way of looking at jazz, and this is my historical supposition, is that it is the result of a confluence of different traditions, some of which do derive from folk traditions, some of which do derive from the interactions between blacks and whites and understandings of European-based harmony and African-based harmony coming together, that it does come out of a marching band tradition, it does come out of elements of ragtime, and that trying to say that there's any one direct lineage is probably the wrong way to look at it, that a lot of it has to do with the way music was working in New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. And those are the three cities that we're going to be concerned with in our early history of jazz. Just to put it briefly, New Orleans is where a lot of the rhythmic material is coming from, a lot of the understanding of that mix of European and African harmony, African-American harmony. Chicago is a center for the expansion of jazz and for really bringing jazz to a popular level. And then New York is where it first gets recorded. But even that sort of division is a little wrong. New York also is the home of James Reese Europe. Chicago is the home of Wilbur Sweatman. These are not New Orleans musicians by any means. And as I've already suggested, I am assuming, I am convinced that they both had a fairly large impact on the sound of early jazz, more than has been sometimes acknowledged. What happens, of course, is there are certain seminal recordings starting around 1917 that we think of as being the center of the explosion of jazz, and then we also have a few almost mythical figures and moments. I already mentioned the Congo Square, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And then also, of course, Buddy Bolden and a series of these early performers who never recorded, and therefore we only have historical accounts of what they were all about. And that leads to a certain amount of myth-making, obviously. So New Orleans, let's start with it. New Orleans is split into the downtown and the uptown. The downtown is where the Creoles were. They're trained musicians. They're musicians with a French heritage, a black and French heritage. They had 3 opera companies just in the one area of New Orleans and a 100-member Negro Philharmonic, right? So a symphony orchestra of black musicians, really Creole musicians. And in New Orleans, that's a distinction that they feel is very important between Creole and black. Now, the uptown Motown musicians were black, untrained. They were blues and gut bucket musicians. And by the 1894 declaration of the Black Code, these two groups, which had been distinct and really didn't have a whole lot to do with each other, they were now all considered black. The Black Code says that all African-derived people were black, that there is no legal distinction between Creole and black. Now, that doesn't mean that the de facto distinction just goes away, but it does mean that there's more mixing now than ever before. Storyville, which we'll talk about more in a moment, shuts down in 1917, and this adds to a diaspora, a spreading out of people from New Orleans to other places like Chicago. The music, appearing perhaps as early as the 1890s, was a mixture of blues, ragtime, second-line drumming, and the Spanish tinge, and we'll talk about all of those in a moment. The original Dixieland Jazz Band comes from this environment, as do Buddy Bolden, King Oliver Armstrong, Sidney Bechet, Kid Ory, Jelly Roll Morton, and Fred Keppard. Here's Storyville. Now, Storyville is an interesting story. It's named after a congressman who, I think his first name was Joseph Story. His last name's obviously Story. Where they were having a problem with rampant prostitution in New Orleans. New Orleans obviously being a port town, so you have a lot of people from the Navy and merchant marines and so on that would come into town, and they were having a bit of a problem with prostitution. So this idea was, well, let's designate a specific area of New Orleans to be the red light district, right? And several cities have red light districts. So from 1897 to 1917, the government in New Orleans, the local government, turns a blind eye to prostitution. That as long as it's within the perimeters of this set of blocks, then it would be not exactly legalized, but not prosecuted. Now, obviously, when you have houses of prostitution, you have, especially when they are more or less sanctioned houses of prostitution, you have a waiting line. You have people that are waiting to visit with the young women. And so there's entertainment often, right? So you have the lobby, you serve drinks, and you have a pianist. The pianist is usually known as a professor, right, of music. And the professor would entertain the people as they're in the ballroom, and that also drowns out the noises coming from above, which, has its own benefits, I suppose. Some of the larger brothels would have a small group that would play, and so one of the discussions of early jazz, notice that this ends in 1917, the very year that jazz is in a sort of more or less straightforward way, is first recorded with the original Dixieland Jazz Band, and their recording in 1917. So Storyville ends right as jazz is becoming something that is nationally recognized. And so this is one of those legends that leads to an understanding of the beginnings of jazz. And we'll never know how big of a role Storyville plays, but it becomes a very key part. There's an early movie with Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong about the importance of Storyville to the story of jazz. So this is a legend that continues to build and continues to be emphasized in various ways. Here you can see a larger map that shows the ordinance was 13032, passed on January 29th of 1897, establishing Storyville. And you can see that it's taking up several streets there, including the very famous Bazin Street, or at least a couple, 3 blocks of Bazin Street. Not that far from Canal Street. So these are, if you've ever been to New Orleans, these are all familiar locations. There's another section, as you can see, over toward the bottom left. One of the ways that they advertised for the various ladies of the evening were these blue books. This is a copy of a Storyville blue book, and it was kind of like a Yellow Pages for prostitutes. It would tell you where that young woman was working, and how much it would be to meet with her, and sometimes it would even have dates of availability, like her regular working days. It depends, but it was something that you would find in a lot of hotel rooms, or you could ask somebody to get a copy, and then you could obviously patronize the Storyville brothels. Some of these some of the prostitutes in New Orleans became very famous in their own right. One of the most famous is Lulu White. You can see she's there in a sort of celebratory photograph, right? Where and people would collect these photographs. She started off as a prostitute and became a very famous madam in the early 20th century, part of Storyville's history. And so you would go to her, and there were a variety of girls working for her. Then there's Chicago and New York City. Chicago's where many of the New Orleans and other players go to make real money by performing in nightclubs. There was just too much competition, obviously, in New Orleans. And also there was a kind of, the New Orleans, as we'll talk about in greater detail in a moment, is so suffused with music that it's harder to get a regular booking outside of these legendary bands like Buddy Bolden's and so on. So many of the New Orleans bands would go to Chicago to play in nightclubs for these extended stays. Supposedly in Chicago, the music became more vigorous, even abrasive, right? Wilbur Sweatman, of course, played in Chicago and lived in Chicago for much of his career, as did the original Dixieland Jazz Band before their New York City debut. They spent a long time in Chicago. Armstrong and Oliver also came there to make their first big break. Now, whether or not the music actually became more vigorous and abrasive, it's hard to say for certain. But it does seem from oral reports that some of the more relaxed tempos and relaxed approach to rhythm of New Orleans is altered when we move to Chicago. New York is, as I said before, where jazz came to record. This is where the first original Dixieland Jazz Band recording was made in 1917. They tried to record with Columbia, but Columbia thought they were too raucous, they were too out of control. And so they wound up on Victor. And listen to, Livery Stable Blues, one of their first recordings, and you'll hear that there's a kind of, there's a lot of energy there, not a lot of discipline all the time. This is highly repetitive music. It's not quite what we're going to think of as what jazz becomes by the time we get into the 20s and certainly into the 30s and 40s. But so you have this sort of almost ritornello kind of form where you have the same strain coming back over and over again with these breaks in between, and it's the breaks with their sort of animal sounds and so on that lead to the name Livery Stable Blues. So jazz, despite the writing of certain scholars and critics, was never really a folk music, right? I'm not saying that it didn't derive in some ways from folk music, but the idea is, for many people, is that it relates to this old tradition of Congo Square. The Congo Square tradition has been debunked, but the idea of it was something that really did happen. Slaves who had the day off on Sundays would congregate around Congo Square, and they would put on these sort of impromptu musical displays with dancing and very drum-driven rhythmic music. And a lot of people, because that was such a big part of New Orleans tradition in the 19th century, have wanted to connect that to jazz. But by the time jazz comes around in the late 1890s, the earliest you could say that were the beginnings of jazz, maybe the 1880s, but even that I think is stretching it. Really, it's the early 20th century. But at any rate, by the time you have any of that, the Congo Square tradition have faded away. There are other folk influences, however, that jazz clearly draws on. For instance, the ecstatic AME and Southern Baptist and Methodist church traditions, the rhythmic and heterophonic clapping and singing, and then, of course, the dancing that goes on in those traditions, where there's a lot of call and response, there's a lot of inflections of blues notes, there's some approximation of a kind of blues harmony that happens in some of this music as best we can tell. We've talked about elements of this before. It's related to the lining out tradition, it's related to the ring shout tradition, and this clearly has some influence on early jazz. Then you have the bent note tradition of spirituals and ring shouts, right? So that the inflection of the blue note. And then you have the amateur harmony singing groups typical of cities like New Orleans. And in fact, of course, Louis Armstrong was making money as a small boy by being part of one of these groups. And these groups were just a group of young kids that would go around on street corners, and they would sing little arrangements of popular songs of the day in 3 or 4 part harmony. And clapping or stomping along as they're singing, in order to make extra money. And that's one of the ways that Louis Armstrong got his start in music, was singing in one of these quartets. Here we have one of the key figures in New Orleans music. This is Joe Oliver. And he was, at first, one of the stars of the amateur marching bands. Joe Oliver's a really interesting character. He started off as a butler, and was just playing in these marching bands as something to do for fun, right? In fact, he wanted to be part of one of the more important bands, and he auditioned several times, and it took him a while to get in to that band. The emphasis of these marching bands was on the same kind of heterophonic performance that we were talking about a moment ago with the AME Church. It combined virtuosity, or rather the heterophonic performance was combined with virtuosity and tight control over timbre and rhythm. And indeed, the brass bands here not only influenced later jazz, but in some ways they developed into jazz bands through the influence of string bands and rough bands like Buddy Bolden's, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But basically, these were the stars of the second line, right? What would happen? Again, this is something that's true and yet still so bound up in myth and legend that it becomes kind of a story that's larger than life. But what happens in New Orleans is when you take someone, when you're taking the corpse to burial in a funeral, you march down to the cemetery with this very slow, lugubrious, sad, mournful music, right? And you bury the person. But on the way back, you play more upbeat music as a celebration of life going on, as a celebration of the dead person's life, and the fact that although we're mournfully letting them go, we're also celebrating the fact that they had a good time, hopefully, while they were alive. And sometimes these songs were almost not exactly sarcastic, but we might take them as being a little less than sanctimonious. Or sanctified. One of the big ones was "Didn't He Ramble," right, which implies that the fellow was a bit of a profligate, that he went around doing whatever he liked, regardless of morality. But it was more in the sense of the upbeat nature of a celebration of life on the way back. And that was the march back, where you had the marching band up front, and then you had the second line. And the second line was mostly people who were just coming around from the neighborhoods, who were usually amateur musicians who were following the main band and adding to it, sometimes by playing instruments, but more often by drumming, which is why it's known as second line drumming sometimes. Let's take a look at some modern day pictures of this tradition. Here you can see the marching band. Here it's, of course, a much more expanded notion, whereas the original notion of the second line band, where these were mostly kids and amateurs who were following the main band. And by the way, the main band was usually amateurs too. They're semi-professionals, right? So for instance, we already mentioned King Oliver, Joe Oliver, who's working as a butler during the day, and practicing on his off hours, and then auditioning for these bands, trying to move up within New Orleans society. So these bands, sometimes they were paid, sometimes they weren't. They were basically semi-professional or amateur bands. And here you can see people following. They're just dressed in everyday clothes, and they're following the main procession. The main procession would have had people in more elaborate clothing, and this is really from carnival. This isn't from a funeral service or anything like that. And you can see the very elaborate clothes that the young women are wearing here, with the ornate hats and the parasols and so on. And then there would be a master of ceremonies, and that's what we see on the next slide. Here's a master of ceremonies, right? Done up in this sort of melange of African-influenced apparel or clothing or style. Louis Armstrong's father was a fairly successful MC. In fact, that was master of ceremonies. In fact, that was one of the ways in which he got to see his father, because his father abandoned him when he was quite young. And so his father sort of represented this figure who was a kind of a good time figure, a guy who was enmeshed in New Orleans society and was celebrated as all of these leaders were, right? This was an honorary position. And so he looked up to his dad while also feeling estranged from his father. And that's a big part of his development as a person and ultimately as a musician, that he wanted to be an entertainer that drew people's attention the way that his father managed to do. Here's an older picture of the second line, and here again you can see in some ways is a little misleading because, like I said, most of the second line would have been percussionists that weren't necessarily dressed up. So this is, I have a feeling, even though I found this picture on Wiki Commons as being an example of the second line, I have a feeling that it's really an example of the marching band, and the second line is what would be behind them. Let's talk a little bit more about marching bands before we move on. Here's Paul Barberin and the Onward Brass Band. This is the band that Joe Oliver wanted so desperately to be a part of, and he auditioned for them several times before finally getting in. And he would spend his time, like when they were finished with a performance, they would of course go to a bar or something, and he would spend his time at the bars trying to impress the various players, trying to find his way in. These bands were not just bands, they were sort of social clubs, right? So these are mostly people who are working other jobs. Very few of them are making their living as musicians. Some of them are giving lessons and so on, and that kind of helps, just like many of us have probably done in our lives at some point or another to get by. But it's a semi-professional group and a social club. And so really, when Joe Oliver was attempting to get into this group, it was more than just a gig for him. Now, on the other side of things is the Buddy Bolden band and these string bands or these gut bucket bands. And when I say string bands, obviously you can see several of them are holding horns there, but what makes it a string band is that there's also a banjo or guitar and then the bass, right? And then there are some string bands that are all strings, but this is more of a blues band or a funky band or a gut bucket band, as they're sometimes called. So these blues/jazz bands like Buddy Bolden's are funkier. They're more blues-based, obviously, and more soloistic, more an emphasis on solos. Buddy Bolden, who never recorded, we'll never get to hear what that sounded like. He was renowned as a good soloist, and people will sometimes even tie Louis Armstrong's solo tradition back to Buddy Bolden, in that may be a tenuous link, but still. Buddy Bolden founded his band in 1895, so quite early, when he was only 18 years old. He played in the various honky-tonks, such as the Funky Butt and the Pig Ankle, and these were in the Tenderloin district of New Orleans. Buddy Bolden is a legendary figure. As I said, he never recorded. And so we can hear the melody of one of his most famous compositions known as the B section. The melody is the B section of St. Louis Tickle, which was recorded by Wes Osman. And then that same melody was recorded as Buddy Bolden's Blues by Jelly Roll Morton. And it would be a worthwhile thing to sit and listen to Jelly Roll Morton talk about Buddy Bolden and then play Buddy Bolden's Blues as he does on those recordings. Those are remarkable recordings, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Here we zoom in a little bit on Buddy Bolden's band, and you can see the guitar, you can see the bass, obviously, and then you have some clarinets, a trombone, and then the cornet, which is what Buddy Bolden's holding. So Buddy Bolden is the man in the back, the second to the left. And you can see he's holding a cornet. A cornet's not quite a trumpet. It's not as loud as a trumpet. It's got a smoother sound. It's also a little harder to control than a trumpet. But it's a early instrument for jazz. Another important element of the development of jazz is this innovative invention here. This is Dee Dee Chandler, and you see him there with the bass drum. And what he did is he developed a foot pedal, and you can see the insert here of what that looks like. So it's simple enough. Anyone who's ever seen a bass drum knows how this works. You got a little foot pedal to operate it, and that way your hands are free to do other things, right? And he developed several patents in the early 1900s for the expansion of the bass drum, and there were several other patents as well. But the most important one was this one, the 1904 invention of the foot pedal by Dee Dee Chandler of New Orleans. And this is one that I want you to remember and know about. Now, of course, we talked about ragtime as an influence on early jazz, and many figures, including Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton, felt that jazz was simply an extension of orchestrated ragtime. That's why Jelly Roll Morton, in those recordings that we'll talk about in a moment that were made for John Lomax, he spends a lot of time talking about the ins and outs of ragtime and where he believes ragtime came from and what it is to rag another tune, right? And what that entails, taking a tune that's already written and then changing the rhythms and making it funkier in essence. So here we have the original Dixieland Jazz Band. They are often regarded as the first band to record jazz. They recorded it in New York in 1917 after coming out of New Orleans and touring in Chicago. One has to be somewhat careful, I suppose, by saying that this is the first jazz recording, because some people would feel that real jazz is not recorded until King Oliver records in 1923. Other people, like me, I think, would suggest that there's already recordings before 1917 of things that basically qualify as jazz. Some of the things that James Reese Europe did, some of the things that Wilbur Sweatman did, are at least no less jazz than the original Dixieland Jazz Band. But again, I think that what we're talking about here is a coming into being, an evolution. We're not talking about something that just snaps into place all at once and boom, there's this thing that's all of a sudden jazz. Rather, we're hearing something in development. And so the original Dixieland Jazz Band is within a relatively early stage of that development. So they had the band leader and trumpeter Nick LaRocca. On March 2nd of 1916, they began a residency at Schiller's Cafe in Chicago under the name of Stein's Dixie Jazz Band, after the drummer, who may have been the original leader, Johnny Stein. They claim to have invented jazz, especially after, their recordings caught on. So by the end of the teens into the early 20s, they're widely regarded as having, inaugurated jazz on the national scene, but they claim to have invented it, that this was their own innovation. And I don't think that was simply them being full of themselves. I think that there were probably certain elements of what they were doing that they felt that they did invent, that they did codify, that they did bring together and more or less create, or at least create that particular mixture. And that might be what they take to be jazz. But certainly the things that most of us take to be jazz were part of, again, this continuum of development that really hasn't gotten to its most refined position yet, even when we're thinking about early jazz. They moved to New York City for a residency at Riesenweber's Cafe in Manhattan under the name Dixie Jazz Band. This is basically Columbus Circle. So if you go to Columbus Circle and you stand near the statue and you look south, what would that be? Southeast, I guess. Then you'll see where that used to be. They were offered a recording audition with Columbia, as I mentioned before, but nothing came of it. They then recorded two sides for Victor, and those were Livery Stable Blues and Dixie Jazz Band One Step on February 26th, 1917. And these are often considered the first jazz releases. They sold at least 250,000 copies, although Victor claims that they sold 1 million, and maybe they did. Records back then, written accounts of record sales are notoriously inaccurate at that time. It's not likely they sold 4 times as many as we know of. It's much more likely that they may have sold twice as many, but who knows. Tiger Rag from 1918 is one of their most popular and influential recordings. Louis Armstrong did his own version of this tune. Virtually every important early jazz group would have had a version of Tiger Rag. Duke Ellington has a version. Everyone has a version of this very popular tune. When you listen to them, notice the polyphonic approach to the various tunes that they play. And then on Tiger Rag, you can also hear a great example of stop time and a shout chorus. Stop time is where the accompaniment is just doing something like dump, bump, bump, and then the soloist carries over the empty space, right? And a shout chorus is what it sounds like, where people are sort of all playing at once in this blaring fashion. Both can be heard very clearly on their rendition of Tiger Rag. Here's Riesenweber's on Columbus Circle back in the day. It's a slightly blurry picture, but you can see it's a rather large venue, and it has a grill and a bar, and the band would have played in that area. Then comes Paul Whiteman, the so-called king of jazz, or self-anointed king of jazz. Basically, by the time we get to the early 20s, we have three types of a jazz orchestra or a jazz band. We have a hot jazz band, and that's what the original Dixieland Jazz Band would have been considered. They play at up tempos. They play kind of raucous gut bucket music, something derived from the gut bucket tradition of Buddy Bolden and so on. Lots of blues-oriented music, music that's meant to be exciting. Then there's the sweet bands, and probably Paul Whiteman, while he did elements of all three, he's more identified with as a sweet band, and they're playing the more orchestrated sounds, right? So they would have the string section. They would play usually softer tunes. It's not that there weren't any blue notes or anything, but it was less exciting dance music, but perhaps better date music. I don't know. And then you have the Latin bands, and we'll talk about them next time. Whiteman's Ambassador Orchestra was a primary example of a sweet band, although he had a subgroup of his best players that performed shorter sets of hot music and then later played some Latin music as well. And many later groups emulated this approach. For instance, Benny Goodman had his big band, and then he also had shorter or smaller groups that he played sometimes in between sets of the big band, or sometimes just separate tours. In 1919, Paul Whiteman's band takes up a residency in Atlantic City at the Ambassador Hotel, and that's why they become known as the Ambassador Orchestra. They're a 10-member group, which is fairly large for 1920. And in 1920, they have a huge hit with the song Whispering, which has, if you listen to it, it has a musical saw on it, so it's very clearly within this sort of novelty tradition of early jazz, just like Livery Stable Blues is meant to be a bit of a novelty, and early jazz really does sell itself by and large as a novelty. This song, Whispering, in 1920 sold well over 1 million, and those are documented copies, so it could have sold a decent amount more than that. He claimed he was making a, quote, lady out of jazz, and he sought a way to create a true jazz orchestra. So he wanted something that was going to combine European elements of orchestration with the more exciting and blues harmony-oriented elements of jazz. So he worked with composers like George Gershwin and Fairgrofe. On February 12, 1924, this was the very famous Aeolian Hall concert in New York City, which was known as the Experiment in Modern Music. And it began with a rendition of Livery Stable Blues, his version of it. And it was an attempt to make a lady out of jazz, and it concluded with the premiere of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. The problem was, and what Paul Whiteman was a little upset was that more people got excited by Livery Stable Blues than any of the rest of it. His entire point was to show how in its relatively short history since at least 1917, jazz had improved and people seemed to like the original. Of course, original might be the wrong term, as we've already seen, but people seem to like the more primitive or the more raucous version of Livery Stable Blues than, say, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. That's not to say, of course, that Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue wasn't a huge deal and that people didn't get very excited by it. It's the one that people talked about more in the papers, but the crowd seemed to react more strongly, at least immediately, to Livery Stable Blues. Here you see a picture from 1923, so this is before the Aeolian Hall concert, but by the time that Paul Whiteman is very well established, here he is standing up, you can see, with his hands folded and his conducting baton tucked beneath his arm, and then his groups around him. And he had some of the best players of his generation. He really made sure that he brought in some of the great arrangers with Fairgrofe, with the Grand Canyon Suite, if you know that piece by Grofe. That was his arranger. That was Paul Whiteman's arranger. And then, of course, the great trumpet player, Bix Beiderbecke, who we'll talk about in a moment, was also in Whiteman's group. So between 1920 and 1934, he had 28 number one records and 150 in the top 10. This record has never been surpassed, not even by the Beatles or Michael Jackson, right? And we'll see the records that they break in the next semester, the things they managed to do, but they've never beaten that particular record of Paul Whiteman's. By 1930, he had franchise bands, just like we saw with James Reese Europe, where you have 11 official bands playing simultaneously around New York, and they're all supposed to be Paul Whiteman bands. As far as I know, he didn't do the James Reese Europe thing of conducting each one, conducting the downbeat of each one, but still. Another 17 bands were touring, so we're talking now 28 bands, and then another 40 were in residences at hotels and so on. So 68 bands. By 1930, he had 68 bands that were Paul Whiteman bands that were just stretched out across the country, right? So he really made a huge impact on music in the early 20s. Whiteman worked hard to counter the bad press jazz received, and I suppose that's the positive spin to put on it, is that he saw himself as a jazz missionary, that what he was doing was he was showing that this is important music. He never denied that it was derived from African American styles. He never tried to pretend that it wasn't, but he did think that what he was doing was in the sort of Dvorak mode of taking some raw, primitive folk material and transforming it into a kind of classical music. And it's hard not to see that as racist. I think it is racist, and certainly self-serving. But at the same time, this is a man who had a real appreciation of the music that he was borrowing from or stealing, depending on how you want to look at it. By 1928, he had, with 19 members, a very large group. He played the largest group around for a while. He played more styles than just jazz, but he had a special interest in jazz and prided himself on that style in particular. He worked with many of the white jazz virtuosi, including cornetist Red Nichols and Bix Beiderbecke, and of course that's a big part of what we're talking about here, that he's not working really with black musicians. He's working exclusively with white musicians. But Bix Beiderbecke is a good example, and Red Nichols. They're both good examples of musicians who have studied closely black jazz styles. And Louis Armstrong thought of Bix Beiderbecke as one of the greatest cornetists working and early trumpet players working. Beiderbecke was also a fantastic composer, a very interesting and sort of doomed guy, doomed to very severe alcoholism and an early death. Now, let's take a look at some other bands that are starting to come up. By the time we get to 1922, we have the first recording of a black band, jazz band, and that was Ory's Creole trombone, featuring his tailgate trombone style. And the tailgate style develops out of those smears that we were talking about when we were looking at Arthur Pryor and the trombonist from the Sousa band and the things that he did on the various cakewalks. That gets adopted in New Orleans to become the so-called tailgate trombone style with those large sweeping glissandi. And so in 1922 he releases Ory's Creole trombone, which is the one I would listen to if I were picking just one, and then the other side of that album was or that record was Society Blues. He really moves away from, and this is an important moment. We're in 1922, so we're 5 years into the official recorded history of jazz. And really, jazz up to that point had been a novelty item. You can hear that in Livery Stable Blues with all the animal sounds. You can hear that in Whispering with the musical saw. It's a kind of novelty music. Even James Reese Europe with his various whistles and slide whistles and sort of wind machine effects and all these things that he does is this kind of gimmicky stuff. Kid Ory is the first band. His band is the first one to move away from that, leaving aside the novelty playing. He has a much gentler swing, and this is where people get the idea that this kind of easy rhythmic flow may have been characteristic of New Orleans music before exposure to Chicago and New York, where the faster tempos may have begun, but no one knows for certain. Kid Ory was certainly very respected in the in New Orleans society. He had worked with several of these marching bands and created several of his own professional bands. And this 1922 recording, which I think is too often forgotten, is one of the important landmarks in the recorded history of jazz. So it's worth listening to for those rhythmic elements especially. Then there's King Joe Oliver, who we've met before, but this is where we'll talk about some of his innovations. He's known for the creative use of the mute on his cornet, and I want you to listen very carefully to his Dipper Mouth Blues, where you can hear one of the great solos prior to Louis Armstrong, one of the great cornet solos. And it's all done with this mute, this wah-wah effect of the mute, which gives it this kind of plaintive cry that very much sounds like somebody sort of talking. I mean, obviously not real words, but vocalizing. And it's one of those recordings, one of those solos that's so popular, and it might even be the first recorded solo that was so popular that people would memorize it and transcribe it and memorize it note for note. Louis Armstrong later plays a version of Dipper Mouth Blues where he basically just does that solo almost note for note. It's not that Louis Armstrong can't improvise his own solos. He's probably the most brilliant improviser of his entire generation, and yet he pays homage to it by just doing the solo. And he's not the only one that sort of re-records it or makes allusions to it in his recorded output. This is one of those very, very celebrated solos. It's one that you should listen to very carefully. He got his start in the celebrated Onward brass band. Actually, we could say he started in other bands before that, but that's where he really started to make his mark, and that's the one I was mentioning before, that social club that he really wanted to be in. That's where Armstrong first met him. Armstrong was a great admirer of Joe Oliver, and he would carry his horn for him when they were not playing, when they were just marching. Louis Armstrong would carry his horn. He was influenced by Buddy Bolden, and then he co-led a New Orleans band with trombonist Kid Ory. So these are the sort of forefathers of New Orleans jazz: Kid Ory, Buddy Bolden, and Joe Oliver. In 1918, he moves to Chicago to join and then lead the Creole Jazz Band, and here's where Louis Armstrong will eventually join him, and they'll make those landmark 1923 recordings that are so celebrated and so worth listening to over and over again. Let's talk about some other members of his band first, though. One of the stars of his band was Johnny Dodds. In 1922, Johnny Dodds took up residency at Lincoln Gardens on Chicago's South Side. Actually, the whole group, the Creole Jazz Band, took residency at the Lincoln Gardens, and the group included several jazz greats: Baby Dodds on drums, Honor Dutry on trombone, a great tailgate trombonist, and then Johnny Dodds on clarinet, and then finally Louis Armstrong will join them on second cornet. Johnny Dodds, he's often sort of dismissed now because his clarinet style is very much that old school New Orleans style, but I think he's an amazing example of it. He's very fleet of finger. He's able to play these rapid arpeggio and scale patterns and keep them very rhythmically precise, and he's very active. And that's one of the things he doesn't do a lot of the long tones and so on that become popular with Sidney Bechet. He's a very active, maybe too busy for some people's taste, clarinetist. With the Creole Jazz Band at this point, the tempos are faster than typical New Orleans music, or at least what we take to be New Orleans music, and the arrangements are much more complex. So instead of that sort of, one of the hallmarks of most New Orleans music is that what you do is you begin, as we heard, or as I hope you heard with the Dixieland Jazz Band, what you do is you begin with pretty much everyone just playing the melody. The bass is playing the bass line and the drums are obviously drumming, but everyone else is playing the melody all together, but they're not playing it all in the same exact way. It's not unison. It's what's known as heterophony, meaning that each person's playing the melody with their own little ornaments or their own way of approaching it. And often the clarinetist's way of approaching the melody is to just play this sort of arpeggiated version of it, sometimes getting away from the melody altogether, but this constant busy activity. And so what that makes is this cacophony of sound, this huge amount of sound that's coming at you, and then you have the breaks, and then you come back to more polyphonic playing. And that's why for some people who aren't used to this kind of music, New Orleans music sounds a little messy. It sounds like there's so much going on you can't possibly figure it out. Well, in order to clarify matters and in order to gain more of an audience in Chicago, what King Oliver wound up doing was he had an arranger who winds up being Lil Hardin, who winds up being Louis Armstrong's first wife. She sort of simplified matters and made things a lot more clear, so it was easier to follow, but it was also easier to demonstrate the kind of virtuosity that they were bringing to this music. In April of 1923, they recorded Dipper Mouth Blues, and this is one of the earliest recordings of an African-American New Orleans band, aside, as we saw, from Kid Ory. The solo for this tune was memorized by many trumpeters, as I've also said. And then there's also Weatherbird Rag, which you should listen to if you get a chance, with the harmonized horns. Here's a transcription of that solo. And, what might be a good idea is to pause this now and open up the tune so that you can hear it. This is a transcription I got online, obviously, and it compares King Oliver's original with Louis Armstrong's rendition of it. And you can see Louis Armstrong sticks pretty close to it. He changes things, obviously, and he's doing it mostly from memory. There are certain things that are very different. But so these are not from the same recording, obviously. The one is from 1923, the other from 1936. The 1923 is what I want you to be interested in. Listen to it very carefully. You'll see he limits himself to very few notes. This piece is in C major. Notice all the E flat. That's the blue note, obviously. Every now and then he'll touch up to the E natural, but for the most part he stays on that E flat. And listen to the timbre of that. That's what's important about blue notes. It's not just that it's a flatted third. It's the timbre. It's the approach. It's the slight bend that they give to it to make it a blue note. So listen for that. Listen to the wah-wah effect. Listen to the fact that at the beginning it's just E flat and C, right? And then he finally sticks a D in there in that sixth measure or so. And then by the seventh measure, I guess. And then by the eighth measure, he's jumping down to the G and the A. But notice how simple it is. It's basically a pentatonic scale, right? C, D, E flat, G, and A. So just those 5 notes. And really concentrating on the E flat to C motion. That's most of it. Then that high G gets introduced in the second chorus of it, right? And then he plays around with that high G for quite a bit. And then in the third chorus, we get to the high A. So notice that he's building as we go along here. He's building tension by expanding the register, expanding the range. But throughout, he never really deviates from those 5 notes. I don't think there's a single F in the whole thing. He keeps to the pentatonic scale. He keeps things very simple, and yet part of that simplicity is set aside by the rhythmic complexity, which is only partially captured by the transcription here. It's not that the transcription's wrong. It's that the rhythms are a little more relaxed and therefore a little more complicated. The best thing to do, honestly, is to try to learn the first chorus on whatever instrument you play, or if you sing it, then sing it. But try to learn that first chorus and really try to internalize those rhythms, and then you'll get some of that magic of what's going on with King Oliver. Here's Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton's one of these characters that we have plenty of recordings of, and we have these wonderful recordings of him sitting with John Lomax, which we'll talk about in a moment. But he's still this kind of legendary figure, in part because he's mythicized himself in those recordings, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. He's a ragtime and early jazz pianist. He often used the habanero rhythm, dup, ba-dup, bup, bup, ba-dup, at various tempi in his left hand, and this is what he referred to sometimes as the Spanish tinge. He felt that what made jazz distinct from other forms of New Orleans music was that it had absorbed more Latin elements, right? And obviously the habanero rhythm is a Latin element that he feels is integral to at least the beginnings of jazz. In 1923, he's in Chicago and he's making recordings, so at the same time that King Oliver's doing so. He claims to have invented jazz. He's not the only one. He claims that he invented it in 1902, but of course he lied about his age, so in 1902 he's only 12. Does that make it impossible? No, but it makes it rather unlikely, and it certainly makes it unlikely in the way that he's talking about it when he says this, and you can hear him say it, by the way. It's part of those John Lomax recordings I keep referring to. His key Chicago recordings are from 1926, though, and they demonstrate an innovative approach to orchestration. I mean, that's really his major contribution, is before Ellington comes along and before some of these other great jazz orchestrators, you have Jelly Roll Morton. Listen, for instance, to Grandpa's Spells, which features Johnny St. Cyr on solo banjo and a novel duet between the trombone and the bass. And normally the banjo is not the instrument that you care about in early jazz, but on this recording you will. And then the duet between the trombone and bass, those instruments, they should be too cloudy to be together, especially on early recordings. It shouldn't work. In the 1920s, 1926, where you're still dealing with very limited I mean, we're moving toward a slightly better sound by 1925, and we'll talk about why that is soon. But you're still dealing with a fairly primitive sound, and yet it comes out beautifully because he's orchestrated it. He's picked the notes just right that they're going to play in their relationship to each other. So listen to that recording. His recordings in 1938 for John Lomax, those are the ones I keep referring to, they feature him playing piano, singing, and reminiscing about the early days of jazz. He demonstrates how one would rag classics, so he takes the Verdi's Miserere from Il Trovatore and he plays it as though it were a ragtime tune, and then he also shows how a jazz artist approached ragtime. So he performs two different versions of Maple Leaf Rag, one that he says is basically what Scott Joplin would have done, and then the other is what he would do as a ragtime pianist. So kind of ragging a rag, right, or a jazzing up a rag, or whatever you want to take it to be. And you'll hear it. It's really worth paying attention to because the main difference is, of course, in the approach to rhythm. And it's subtle. And it's, again, one of those things that you have to kind of internalize. It's not something you can just transcribe and point to it and say, here it is. It's something you really have to listen to carefully to get a sense of that feel, right? And that's why we call it a rhythmic feel. It's not something we can demonstrate very clearly. And then he discusses in these recordings a time that is largely opaque to history. So he really gives us a purview onto these performers and these moments in the development of jazz that we don't know about other than through him. Now, you have to take some of this with a grain of salt. They're a treasure trove of insights, but he's also putting himself at the center of a lot of the history of jazz, which makes it kind of fun in a way. He also, this is only 1938, so granted, there are already recordings of what we might think of as real blues by this point. We're going to talk about that in an upcoming session. But he also gives a brief history of the beginnings of certain elements of the blues that are worth taking note of as well. And he shows some of the variety of lyrics that came to some of these blues songs, some of which are, of course, quite dirty, quite scandalizing. They're remarkable recordings. There was a time in my life where I listened to them every night with headphones before going to sleep just to get the sound of his voice and the sound of the way he tells stories. It's an amazing document, even if we can't take it as being, the absolute truth. It is a sort of oral tradition truth that he's carrying out here. Another important figure is Sidney Bechet. He's the rival and immediate predecessor to Louis Armstrong as an early great jazz soloist. He played the clarinet and soprano saxophone. He's one of the first recorded jazz players on soprano saxophone. That's an instrument that can easily sound not great, and he makes it sound amazing. He played with intense rhythmic verve and technical virtuosity and improvised much more freely and more often than most of his contemporaries. Prior to Bechet, the clarinet, like we saw with Johnny Dodds, often played decorative, ornamented versions of the melody in the heterophonic texture. Bechet made the clarinet more of a lead instrument. Johnny Dodds soloed. He did have some lead moments, but he wasn't the featured member of the band that Bechet obviously will be. The earliest surviving recordings of Bechet are from 1923. In October of 1924, he recorded Texas Moaner Blues, which is worth listening to. That's with Clarence Williams as the leader and playing on piano. And then it's also with Louis Armstrong and Charles Irvis on trombone. And the three of them, Bechet, Armstrong, and Irvis, are really worth paying attention to on that really quite remarkable recording. Notice the utter freedom with respect to the beat from both Armstrong and Bechet. It's almost as though they're always aware, obviously, of the underlying beat. They're some of the best players to the time pulse that I can think of, and yet they are all over the place. They pull back, they get a little ahead. This isn't just that one note kind of this is how you swing approach that many of us may have been taught when we were taught our approach to rhythm in jazz. They're really experimenting with rhythm in the same way that we might experiment with harmonic effects or dissonance. It's clearly very conscious, and it's also clearly very remarkable. It's amazing to listen to. With Oliver and with this recording, really listen and try to internalize the sense of rhythm that's going on here. He again recorded with Williams and Armstrong on January 8th of 1925 with Cakewalkin' Babies from Home, and that's another pretty celebrated early recording. He considered this recording, where he and Armstrong really attempted to push each other into new territory, he considered this as the direction jazz was going to head in right into the 1940s, and so he thinks of this as one of his most important recordings. For my taste, I prefer Texas Motor Blues for various reasons that we can discuss at some point if you like, but Cakewalkin' Babies is another really amazing recording. Bechet goes on to have one of the truly remarkable careers in jazz, in early jazz. His later recordings are the foundation of his reputation, however. The recordings that we were just talking about, Cakewalkin' Babies, Back Home, and so on, those are important in the early histories of jazz. If you read histories of jazz, you'll often see them mentioned, especially people who are interested in the New Orleans elements of the beginnings of jazz, which most historians are. But they're not the things that get put on retrospective CDs that often, and sometimes they do, of course, but they're not the more celebrated recordings. The celebrated ones are recorded in the 1930s and 40s by Bechet. The standouts, to my mind, are Summertime, his version of Summertime from 1939, where he's on soprano sax with Teddy Bunn, a forgotten but amazing musician, on guitar. And that is one of the most just striking versions of Summertime. This tune by Gershwin that some people feel is overplayed and a little mawkish, a little too sentimental. He does some amazing things with it, and his interaction with Teddy Bunn is just it's one of the great moments, I think, of recorded jazz. And then, of course, the very celebrated Blue Horizon in 1944, where he's playing clarinet. The Summertime features a restrained performance of the melody, the head, but then these low register growls are introduced that in that characteristic vibrato and more exploratory playing, and he really pushes the tune toward the end. Blue Horizon features the wide-ranging excitement Bechet could bring out of a clarinet with its bent notes, the exploration of the chalumeau, the lower register of the clarinet, which has a very distinctive timbre, and then, of course, those screaming high notes. And try to get around to listening to these two recordings. They're like I said, they're two of the standout moments, certainly in his career, if not in all of early jazz. And Summertime, to me, is one of the great moments.